The Once and Future Present, Episode 36, Revolution and the Red Dawn. Welcome back to The Once and Future Present, an AP European History podcast from Hammer History Productions. I'm your host, Casey Brooks, and today's episode marks a turning point, not just for Europe, but for the world. The Great War is over, but what came next was something entirely new. Revolution, collapse, and the birth of ideologies that would shape the 20th century. With me, as always, are Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo.
That's right, Casey. The First World War didn't end cleanly. It shattered the old order. Monarchies fell in Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And in Russia, the war's pressures unleashed something extraordinary. The Russian revolutions of 1917, which transformed a crumbling empire into the world's first communist state.
Let's start there. But before we jump straight into 1917, could you give us a little background on Russia's earlier struggles? I know serfdom ended in the 1800s, but I've heard that didn't really change much for most people.
You're absolutely right, Casey. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 was supposed to transform Russian society, but it was a half measure. Former serfs were technically free, yet they had to buy the land they worked from their landlords through long-term payments called redemption dues. Most peasants ended up poorer than before, trapped in a cycle of debt and poverty. The nobility kept much of their land, and rural inequality remained.
That frustration simmered for decades. Russia modernized more slowly than Western Europe. Industrialization didn't really accelerate until the 1890s. When factories did appear, they brought new urban problems, long hours, poor conditions, and little political voice. These tensions exploded in the Revolution of 1905, after Russia's defeat in the Russo-Japanese War.
What happened in that revolution?
In January 1905, peaceful protesters led by Father Georgy Gapon marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg to petition the Tsar for better working conditions. The army fired on them, killing hundreds in what became known as Bloody Sunday. That massacre shattered faith in the Tsar and triggered strikes, mutinies, and uprisings across the empire.
Tsar Nicholas II responded by granting limited reforms in the October Manifesto, creating a parliament called the Duma. But he quickly undermined it, keeping most power for himself. The result was widespread cynicism and resentment toward the monarchy, resentment that would erupt again in 1917.
That makes a lot more sense now. The revolution didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Exactly. By the time World War I began, the empire was already brittle from decades of failed reform and social unrest.
So, when World War I erupted, it sounds like Russia was already heading toward collapse. How did the pressures of the war push the empire past its breaking point?
The war became the final test for a system that was already unstable. Mobilization exposed the empire's weaknesses: poor infrastructure, outdated leadership, and deep social inequality. The same peasants who had struggled under serfdom now found themselves sent to the front without food, rifles, or even shoes. Each defeat on the battlefield deepened the anger at home, setting the stage for revolution.
On the home front, food and fuel shortages caused riots, and factory strikes spread through the cities. The Tsar's decision to take personal command of the army left the government in the hands of Tsarina Alexandra and her controversial advisor Rasputin, whose influence discredited the monarchy further.
So, when did things finally break down?
In February 1917, protests in Petrograd, today's St. Petersburg, turned into a mass uprising. Soldiers joined the demonstrators instead of firing on them. Within days, Nicholas II abdicated, ending 3 centuries of Romanov rule.
But removing the Tsar didn't solve Russia's problems. It created a new dilemma. Two groups now claimed authority over the country. On one side was the provisional government, made up of liberal politicians and moderate socialists who wanted to build a democratic system and continue the war to preserve national honor. On the other side were the Petrograd Soviets, councils of workers and soldiers demanding immediate peace, land redistribution, and power to the people.
So there were basically two governments at once?
Exactly, what historians call dual authority. The provisional government had official legitimacy, but the Soviets had the trust of the people and control of the military. This division made decisive leadership impossible. Every decision about the war, land reform, or the economy turned into a power struggle.
Into this chaos stepped the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky. When Lenin returned from exile in April 1917, thanks to German assistance, he brought a clear message: end the war, give land to the peasants, and transfer all power to the Soviets. His slogan, peace, land, and bread, captured exactly what the exhausted population wanted.
Before we get to that, could you talk about what was happening in the army during this period? I've read something about the Petrograd Soviet issuing orders that weakened discipline.
That's right. In March 1917, the Petrograd Soviet issued Army Order No. 1, which stripped officers of authority and gave power to committees of soldiers. The order was meant to democratize the army, but in practice it destroyed discipline. Soldiers deserted in the hundreds of thousands, often returning home to seize land for themselves. This chaos made the provisional government's goal of continuing the war almost impossible.
And who was leading the provisional government by then?
In July 1917, Alexander Kerensky, a moderate socialist, became prime minister. He tried to balance loyalty to the Allies with promises of reform, but his decision to continue the war cost him popular support. When he refused to redistribute land, peasants took matters into their own hands.
Then came the Kornilov affair in September 1917. General Lavur Kornilov attempted a right-wing coup to restore order, claiming he wanted to save the country from anarchy. Kerensky panicked and armed the Petrograd Soviets, including the Bolsheviks, to defend the capital. The coup failed, but it made the government look weak and made the Bolsheviks seem like defenders of the revolution.
So, by the time the Bolsheviks made their move in October, the provisional government had lost almost all credibility.
Exactly. By autumn 1917, morale in the army had collapsed, and the Bolsheviks were the only party promising peace and stability.
So, how did the Bolsheviks move from being just one faction among many to actually taking control?
Through organization and timing. By the fall of 1917, the provisional government was losing credibility. Its military offensives failed, inflation soared, and people were desperate. Trotsky helped form the Military Revolutionary Committee, an armed group of Red Guards loyal to the Bolsheviks. On October 25, November 7 by the modern calendar, they seized key points in Petrograd, bridges, telegraph offices, and railway stations, then surrounded the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was meeting.
The coup was surprisingly quick and almost bloodless. The ministers were arrested, and Lenin announced that the Soviets were now the legitimate government of Russia. But when elections were held later that year, the Constituent Assembly, Russia's first democratically elected parliament, rejected Bolshevik dominance. When it convened in January 1918, the Bolsheviks had won only about 1/4 of the seats. Lenin responded by ordering soldiers to dissolve the assembly, declaring that true power belonged to the Soviets, not bourgeois democracy. The new regime immediately issued decrees ending Russia's participation in the war and redistributing land.
That's when Russia made peace with Germany, right?
Yes. In March 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, giving up huge territories, Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, to secure peace. Many saw it as humiliating, but Lenin argued that survival of the revolution was more important than defending empire.
But peace abroad meant war at home. The Russian Civil War broke out between the Reds, the Bolsheviks and their supporters, and the Whites, a loose alliance of monarchists, liberals, and foreign armies seeking to overthrow them. From 1918 to 1921, Russia was plunged into chaos.
Did the Allies really get involved in that?
They did. Britain, France, Japan, and the United States sent troops and supplies to support the Whites, hoping to stop communism from spreading and to reopen the Eastern Front. But the interventions were uncoordinated and ultimately failed.
The Red Army, organized by Trotsky, was far more unified. They used propaganda to portray their fight as a defense of the revolution. The Bolsheviks also unleashed the Cheka, their secret police, to crush dissent through arrests and executions. This campaign of political repression became known as the Red Terror.
That sounds horrific. How did the war finally end?
By 1921, the Reds had triumphed. Their victory owed much to geography and organization. The Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartland around Moscow and Petrograd, giving them access to factories, railways, and communication lines. The Whites, scattered across distant regions, never coordinated effectively. Foreign intervention further discredited them as agents of outside powers. But victory came at a terrible cost. Millions died from battle, famine, and disease. During the Red Terror, the Bolsheviks executed thousands of political opponents, including, in 1918, Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their children, ending the Romanov dynasty forever. Russia emerged exhausted, isolated, and transformed into the world's first communist state.
So out of one of Europe's most conservative monarchies came one of its most radical revolutions.
Exactly. The collapse of the old empire created a new model of power and fear that would influence global politics for the rest of the century.
But how did Lenin's vision for Russia actually compare to Karl Marx's original ideas about communism?
That's a great question. Karl Marx believed that a socialist revolution would first take place in an advanced industrial society, like Britain or Germany, where workers had developed class consciousness through factory labor. Russia, by contrast, was still largely agrarian. Lenin took Marx's theory and adapted it to Russian reality. He argued that a small, disciplined vanguard party could lead the revolution on behalf of the working class, even if that class wasn't yet fully developed. In doing so, he made Marxism revolutionary in practice, not just in theory.
Lenin also introduced new policies to transform society immediately. During the Civil War, his government imposed war communism, a system where the state seized grain from peasants, nationalized industry, and centralized all economic production to supply the Red Army. It was brutally efficient, but economically disastrous. Peasants resisted, production collapsed, and famine spread.
So how did the government recover from that?
By 1921, Lenin realized that pure command economy couldn't sustain the country. He replaced war communism with the new economic policy, NEP. It allowed small-scale private trade and local markets while keeping key industries like banking and heavy manufacturing under state control. The NEP was a temporary compromise meant to stabilize the economy and win back popular support.
The NEP reflected Lenin's pragmatism. He still believed in the eventual goal of a classless society, but he accepted that the path there would be uneven. For many Russians, it felt like a brief breath of normal life after years of war and chaos.
It sounds like the revolution wasn't just political. It was also an experiment in how to rebuild a society from the ground up.
Exactly. And that experiment set the tone for the rest of the 20th century. Lenin's blend of ideology and authoritarian control would influence leaders across the world, including his own successors.
I remember you mentioned Lenin's April Theses earlier. What exactly were those?
When Lenin returned to Petrograd in April 1917, he published the April Theses, a set of radical proposals calling for an immediate end to the war, land redistribution, and all power to the Soviets. They shocked even some of his fellow Bolsheviks, but they clearly outlined his vision for a socialist state led by workers and peasants.
And after years of conflict, Russia faced one final ordeal: the famine of 1921. Drought, war damage, and the disruptions of war communism led to food shortages that killed millions. Ironically, relief came from an unexpected source. American aid, organized by the American Relief Administration, helped feed millions of Russians. It was one of the few moments of cooperation between the Soviet government and the West during Lenin's rule.
So even after all the upheaval, there were glimpses of recovery and small connections with the outside world.
Exactly. The new economic policy and the famine relief marked a short, fragile pause between revolution and reconstruction. But the larger question remained: could the ideals of 1917 coexist with the realities of power and survival?
And that uncertainty would carry into the interwar years, as Europe tried to rebuild and redefine itself in the shadow of revolution. So when Lenin died in 1924, the question of who would carry that vision forward must have been huge.
It was. His death left a power struggle between Leon Trotsky, who wanted a permanent global revolution, and Joseph Stalin, who promoted socialism in one country. That struggle would define the next chapter of Soviet history.
It sounds like Lenin's death left Russia at a crossroads between revolution and rebuilding, ideology and survival. What came next would decide not just Russia's future, but the world's.
Exactly. The ideals of 1917 had given way to power struggles and pragmatic compromises. As the 1920s began, Europe stood between hope and instability, unsure whether the new order would bring peace or more upheaval.
And we'll pick up with that story in our next episode, as Europe tries to recover from war and faces the fragile peace of the interwar years.
Always a pleasure, Casey.
Thanks, Casey.
And thanks to all of you for listening to the Once and Future Present, Episode 36, Revolution and the Red Dawn. Join us next time as we explore how the end of one revolution gave rise to the uncertain peace that followed.